Hi, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to our stream for AP World, but really any of the AP histories. My name is Melissa, and tonight we're going to be talking about the LEQ, the long essay question. I'm going to pop us into the next slide, talk a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. So this is Fiveable. If this is your first time watching a Fiveable stream, welcome. If you are a veteran, welcome back. We're glad to have you. We are a community of streamers and content creators who are trying to help support students all around the world, especially as they're preparing for AP exams. This stream is being hosted as part of our AP World curriculum, so hopefully many of you are AP World folks out there. I'm an AP World teacher, so all my examples are going to be from world history, but a lot of the skills that we're talking about tonight are going to be really applicable in a lot of different areas. Tonight, though, we are talking about the long essay question, and we're going to play a little bit of a game. So if you are out there in the chat, get ready, get your fingers ready to give me some responses, because this focus on what does a good LEQ essay look like, I think can be best taught by looking at examples. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief overview of some of the elements of the LEQ, and then I'm going to show you some samples, and I'm going to let you, well, I'm going to force you actually to choose between two samples. Which one do you think is stronger? And then we'll talk through the different samples and where they're strong and where they could be improved. And then hopefully give you a little bit of practice time as well to do a little bit of writing on the same practice prompt and put some of your skills into action, because I'm a big believer that the best way to become a better writer is to write. And that applies in history writing, that applies in English writing. If you are going to do any kind of writing, the best way to get better at it is to do it. And it's really hard and it's really uncomfortable and it can be really scary. So this is a safe, encouraging place where we're going to practice, we're going to look at some things, and we're going to answer your questions. You can ask questions right here in the chat. We don't have like 1,000 people logged in right now to make the chat too crazy. But if you for sure want me to see your question, there is an ask a question button that you can click as well. And if you type your question into that box, it'll pop up a notification for me that you want a question answered. But if you type your question into the chat as well, I can definitely answer that. Or other people will be able to see and answer your question as well. We'd love to get the chat hopping tonight with your questions, your suggestions, your input. Students and teachers are welcome to contribute, because we all have a lot to contribute and share in terms of our skills and our knowledge about writing. So let's get rolling. I want to start talking just briefly about thesis statements, because the first thing we're going to look at in the LEQ is the thesis. And as I'm talking about the thesis, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to, this is the link to the sample prompt that we're going to be working with tonight. I modified an old AP prompt to be more in line with the content and the structure that they're using for their LEQ essays now. And so if you click on that Google Doc, it'll take you to a Google Doc that has the prompt and the directions, so you can see what our authors were writing about when they wrote the samples we're going to look at tonight. And we're going to start with the thesis. We're just going to look, we're not going to look at whole essays tonight, but we're going to start by looking at thesis statements from a few different essays, because I think that the thesis statement is the most important thing to focus on when you are writing your LEQs, especially at this point in the year, right? We're at almost the end of November. We're at the point where you've probably gotten a few units in, you have some content knowledge, you're starting to build your skills in writing, even if you haven't done a ton of practice. Hopefully you've had a chance to practice with an LEQ or a DBQ and maybe some SAQs, short answer questions as well. But the thesis, if you can nail the thesis, that's really the organizing structure for your essay as a whole. So really briefly, just want to run through, what are we looking for in a solid thesis? First thing that the College Board asks us for is this phrase, historically defensible claim. A claim is just your argument. What are you trying to talk about in the essay as a whole? And your thesis should introduce the overall concepts that you're planning to discuss. Historically defensible means that it's accurate or plausible. It means that with historical evidence, you could reasonably defend that position, which means that your thesis has an element of opinion to it. And that's not something we often think about in nonfiction writing, but, or in scholarly academic writing, having opinion in it, but it's true, we do. And so these are historical opinions based on evidence, but we're making a claim. And that's a big part of the thesis statement. Your thesis statement needs to be relevant to the prompt. Sometimes I see when students get a prompt, they see just one keyword in the prompt and they focus in on that word and they write a whole big, beautiful essay about that one word. And it's not the right word. So we want to look at the prompt as a whole. And before we look at samples, we are going to look at the prompts together for those of you who aren't able to open that Google Doc. And hopefully everybody can. So that you can see the prompt and you can think about, okay, what would a relevant answer look like? You got to address the question. A good thesis should establish a line of reasoning. That's the language that the College Board uses. And what we mean is that your thesis should set up a plan for your body paragraphs. Your reader should know what your essay is going to be about from the opening paragraph. I like to think of this as a because element. The strongest thesis statements have not only a statement of claim, but a because element that establishes how you plan to prove that and defend that in the course of your essay. And then, like, above and beyond, really strong thesis statements have an element of complexity. Now, complexity isn't a requirement to earn the thesis point on the rubric, but I did a stream a few weeks ago about the DBQ, talking about analysis and reasoning and the complexity point on that rubric. And I really believe that you can work your way into a complex argument if you start with a complex thesis. So I encourage students to plan ahead for their complex analysis. And this could be by including a counterclaim or an alternate viewpoint, or some other complex idea in your thesis. And when we look at some of the examples, we'll see some of these essays that are setting themselves up for some complex thinking. It might be the idea of a however, A is true because of B. However, C is also a factor in this case. And that's a really ugly, like made up off the top of my head thesis right there, but you get the idea of how that flow could work. So we're going to look at some thesis statements. And we're going to play a game, and I call it You Can Only Have One. So the next slide I put up is going to be the prompt, and I'll read through the prompt. And then I'm going to put up a series of slides that have two different samples on them side by side. So sample A and sample B. I'd like you to read both samples. I'll read them out loud as well for those of you with little tiny phone screens so you can hear them. But you have to pick one. And I want you to, in the chat, at least tell me the letter of which sample you think is stronger. And if you have a reason why, I'd love to hear your reasoning for why you think that sample is stronger. It's not necessarily that one is good and one is bad, but which one, if you were forced to pick one, which one would you say is stronger? So here's the prompt that these students were responding to. The introductory kind of background info given by the College Board would say something along the lines of, in the period 1450 to 1750, empires achieved increased scope and influence around the world, shaping and being shaped by the diverse populations they incorporated. But the actual prompt is there at the bottom, and it says, develop an argument that compares the process of empire building in land-based and maritime empires in the period 1450 to 1750 CE. So all of these samples that we're going to look at are responding to this prompt, and they respond to it in a variety of different ways. So we're looking at land-based empires, maritime empires. We're looking at hopefully a comparative statement, because that word compare is directly in this prompt. And we're looking at the idea of the process of empire building in this early modern period. So here are our first two samples. Sample A is on the white half of the screen, and it says, Land-based empires and maritime empires had the same amount of influence, but land-based empires were more diverse. Sample B says, land-based empires such as China focused more on the imports of their country, like silver, which is also like the Netherlands, who focused more on the imports of spices and goods. But the Netherlands then exported goods from Indonesia to countries around the region they were in. And China imported silver sold by European merchants from the Americas and Japan and kept it for their country alone. So take a minute, think about these two samples and vote. Which sample do you think is stronger? And why? Why would you choose that sample? We already have a vote in the chat for sample B. Addison, are you willing to follow up with your reasoning? Why do you like B better? Got another vote for B from Nevea. So, okay, 3 votes for B. People are liking B. Are you liking B just because it's longer? I mean, it's not a bad reason, but I don't know. Why do people like B? Provide specific reasoning, examples, and it has evidence. Yeah, Addison, I would agree with that. Sample B has a lot going for it. It has comparative language in it. Right, we see that, which is also like, right, so we've got the similarity between China and the Netherlands in terms of imports. And then a difference where it describes, but the Netherlands did, moved goods around versus China imported goods and kept them within their country alone. So we have that comparative language in sample B. We've got specific topics and regions. This sample correctly addresses land versus maritime empires, which is really important for this prompt, right? It asks you to compare both. So you need your examples that you're choosing do need to be land and maritime empires. I think one thing that would make sample B even stronger would be the focus on that process of empire building, because this thesis is very focused on the economies of both of these regions. And it's clear that the student really understands and knows something about the economic foundation of both empires. And economics is a factor in empire building. So I think we would give credit for this thesis. I think that there's room in this thesis to broaden the scope and to think a little bit more broadly about different ways that empires could be built, because that gives you room in your body paragraphs for lots of different kinds of examples. But I think B has done a really nice job. Now, A, it is a more limited answer, right? It's much shorter. Notice that it's just one sentence. You can write a good thesis statement in a single sentence, and this one has some good things about it. And I want to point some good things out about sample A before we look at our next examples, right? There's comparative language in sample A. Land-based empires and maritime empires had the same amount of influence. There's a clear similarity. And then there's a clear difference that the land-based empires were more diverse. So there's that comparative language right there in that one tidy sentence. What we really, though, want is more about that process of empire building, right? That idea of influence is maybe a little vague. So could we clarify what that means or what that looks like? Could we talk about the importance or the significance of diversity in diversity in land-based empires compared to the maritime empires, right? Having a little bit, right, taking a couple of sentences, expanding sample A into a couple of sentences would make it a stronger response. I've got a question in my question box and I'm going to look at it right now. All right, so this question in the question box looks like something that's going to be great for the end of the session because it's not directly related to thesis statements. So Addison, I see your question and I'll come back to it at the end, but I want to look at a few more thesis statements since that's our focus for this part of the stream tonight. All right, here we got another couple of samples. So new sample A says the wave of trade and new technology helped build many land-based and maritime empires, with silver becoming a high demand maritime, spelling doesn't really count, maritime empires like Japan grew. So that's sample A. By the way, you are going to see some spelling errors in the samples that you see tonight. I just took them from some volunteer student work. So thank you, students who contributed your work to tonight's stream. Spelling errors do not count against you. So if we see stuff that's misspelled or a little bit awkwardly worded, that shouldn't factor into our decisions. All right, so sample A, that was it. Sample B now says, both Spain and the Mughals were working to make their empires more successful, yet the Spanish focused on exploration and things outside their land, while the Mughal Empire was more focused on improving things at home. Which one do you like, A or B? Got one vote for B. Got a vote for A. Johnny, tell me what you like about sample A. Addison's saying that sample B gives comparison and reasoning. So what do you like about sample A? I know, I put you on the spot and now you're typing while everyone seems like they're waiting for you. It's okay. I'll talk a little bit about what I see in these samples, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and your feedback about these samples as well. So the first thing that I notice in sample A as a strength is that we've got a connection to a specific civilization, right? This person tells us from the beginning that we're going to be looking at Japan in this essay. I would question whether Japan should be counted as a maritime empire in the 1450 to 1750 time period. Certainly in a later time period, right after the Industrial Revolution in Japan, as Japan's empire really starts to expand, it's going to behave more like the maritime empires. But in this time period, Japan is relatively isolated and intentionally isolated, and its empire building behaves a lot more like the land empires than like the maritime empires created by the Europeans. So I would generally include Japan as a land empire if I was going to categorize it. That said, we've got a specific example, and that can be a really good strategy. If you're thinking, oh, this prompt is way too broad, then just narrow it and pick a couple of examples that relate to the specific topics. What I don't see in sample A is comparative language. Right? We've got an idea of like trade and new technology helped build the land-based and maritime empires. So maybe there's a little bit of a similarity there. What we don't see, though, is a clear indication of what that similarity is. And we don't have any idea about difference. And you don't have to have similarity and difference necessarily, but I would say that's always a good strategy, right? That's building a complex argument, similarity and difference. In sample B, we do have comparative language, both Spain and the Mughals. And then yet the Spanish, while the Mughals. So that comparative language, we have similarity and difference, which is really helpful. We've got another example with specific empires being chosen rather than just land-based and maritime in general. We're choosing two examples. We're going to treat the Mughals as a land-based empire because even though they have a lot of coastline and a lot of connection to Indian Ocean trade, a land-based empire is going to be an empire whose territory is largely connected in the same piece of land. So the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, the American empires prior to European conquest, not really in this time period, but in the earlier, if this was for an earlier time period, we could look at the Aztec or the Inca. We could look at most of the Chinese dynasties, if I didn't say them already. We could look at African empires, such as the Songhai in this time period. So the Mughals would be our land empire in this example. And then the Spanish, who had to sail across oceans to claim territory for their empires, rather than expanding into the land next door. That is what we would define as a maritime empire. And I should have defined that before we started. So sorry about that. Sorry. So sample B has a lot going for it. In terms of like areas for improvement, I would say that the difference is stronger than the similarity in sample B. And so this is a nice thesis. I think it earns credit. I think, though, that it's the idea that they are working to make their empires more successful. That phrase is maybe a little vague, and I would love to see a more concrete similarity, a clear, like specific that we would think about. And yes, Eric is pointing out that we have the idea of building empires. That's good, empire, right? It's connecting to the prompt. It's about empire building. So using that language is really helpful. That comparative piece, if we can combine the empire building in sample A with the comparative language in sample B, we would get a lot closer to something really great. So let's take a look at one more forced choice between thesis statements. So new sample A says, the greatest difference between the two empires was their goals for conquest. Spain was a merchant empire. The whole structure allowed for the free exchange of goods, while the Ottomans maintained a militant empire. Their goal was power through strength of arms. Sample B says, there are more differences than similarities in the building of land-based and maritime empires. In most cases, how they expanded was similar, but the reasons and nature of these empires is different. So what do you like? I've got one vote for B, okay? What else? Or who else would like to vote? Okay, got to vote for A. Another vote for A. All right. So what are you seeing in these samples? I've talked you through now 4 samples. So tell me some things that you're noticing that you like about the sample that you chose, because we're now evenly split. We've got 2 votes for B and 2 votes for A. And there are good things about both of these samples. You know, I didn't just pick one good and one bad every time. There's no right answer. All right. While you're thinking about the things that you like, I will talk to you a little bit about the things that I like. Okay, so sample A goes more in depth with more specifics. Yeah, there is a lot of specific language in sample A. I like sample B, gets to the point without being too wordy. Yes, direct language can be really helpful. Those are both great things to notice about each of these samples. I think sample A does an excellent job of clearly stating a difference. And because the prompt simply says compare, the prompt doesn't specify that you have to have similarities and difference, you could earn a thesis point for a thesis that looked like sample A, that just addresses difference because it's really clear. There's a connection to a relevant land empire and a relevant maritime empire. There's language about the process of empire building, right? Merchant empire versus military empire. So we have some good topics that are stated for us. We have that comparative language about difference in sample A. What we don't have is a similarity. That would make sample A a stronger response. Sample B uses really great comparative language for both similarity and difference. Right, how they expanded was similar. The reasons and nature of these empires is different. This is where I think sample B struggles a little bit because we're right to notice that it's really concise. I think, though, that brevity or being concise in this sample is actually its downfall because it's a little bit unclear exactly what this student is planning to write about in their body paragraphs. It would be great to know a little bit more about what the student means by reasons and nature of the empires. So is it like the reasons why the empires expanded? Or is it reasons why the empires were successful? Is it I don't know what nature of the empires means. I didn't write this thesis. So, right, and I can't assume. Well, I can only go with what the words on the page actually say as the reader. So I would want my sample B author to come back with maybe 1 or 2 more sentences that gives me just a little bit more detail. And that's something I want to encourage you with as you're thinking about thesis statement writing. It's the idea that when you are writing your thesis statement, it doesn't have to be a single sentence. It can be 2 sentences, 3 sentences. The only kind of rules about it is that all the sentences for your thesis have to be together. They can't be spread out throughout the whole essay. And it has to be in the introduction of your essay. So it could be 4 sentences, 5 sentences. I think that's a little bit overkill. But it could be, right, 2, 3, or 4 sentences long. And if, for clarity's sake or for grammar's sake, or just that you're really struggling to put your ideas on the paper, if it takes you that long to get to your thesis, that's okay. I would rather have you write your way into a good thesis than feel constrained by trying to cram it into 1 or 2 sentences. And that's, that's one teacher's opinion. Your teacher might be encouraging you to go short. And if that's the case, then do your best to cram a lot of detail into those short sentences that your teacher is asking for so that you can be sure that you are setting yourself up for success. All right, at this point, we're about halfway through our stream, and I want to get a little bit of a vote from you. We've got a couple of options here. We can look at some sample body paragraphs and do this same process of analyzing sample body paragraphs, or we can take a break from analyzing samples and give you a few minutes to write a practice thesis of your own and put some of these ideas to work before we look at new samples. So vote practice or samples. If you'll just vote in the chat, that'll let me know what people want to do, and we'll make that our next step. So I'll give you about 60 seconds to vote. I got 1 vote for samples. 2 votes for samples. Okay. All right. My inclination, okay, 3 votes for samples. We're starting to see a trend. That was my inclination as well. So let me jump to the next slide. So before we start looking at the next batch of samples, these will be body paragraphs. And I just want to remind you, if I'm a reader, so if I'm grading my students' essays, these are the things that I'm looking for in the body paragraph. I'm looking for a body paragraph to do 3 things. Number 1, I want the body paragraph to show me a development of the argument. So ideally, I would hope for a topic sentence that connects the body paragraph back to the thesis, right? Establishes, is this the similarity? Is this a difference? What are we talking about here? I want my body paragraph to include evidence. I want specific, accurate, relevant evidence. I want multiple pieces of evidence in each body paragraph. And I want that evidence to then link back to the argument that's being made. So explain or connect your evidence back to your topic sentence. So those are the 3 kind of primary characteristics I'm looking for in a body paragraph. And if you look for those 3 things in these body paragraphs, I think that's going to help you as you vote on some more samples. So once again, you can only have 1. The text on these by necessity has gotten a little bit smaller, but we're going to do the same thing, 2 samples side by side. I'll read each one for those of you on tiny screens, and then you can vote. And I would love if you, after you vote, if you type out in the chat, what are some of the things that you notice, pros and cons about the body paragraph that you voted for? Because none of these are like perfect, amazing. Well, some of them are amazing, but none of these are perfect without flaws. So we want to think about what would we like, what would we improve about each of these samples. So here's our first batch. Sample A says, an explorer by the name of Vasco da Gama went to Southeast Asian countries to attempt trade. Buy products from Europe, I think maybe it's supposed to say, but products from Europe did not interest them, so da Gama didn't do much of an exchange. He did get a lot of spices and goods from Southeast Asia that proved to be beneficial in Europe. To make more money and avoid paying others, they searched for a new way to Southeast Asia. This is when they discovered the Americas. Sample B. In 1492, in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella allowed Christopher Columbus to take a voyage. On this voyage, Columbus was the first European to discover America. He landed in the Caribbean and was greeted by a group of Indians. They thought of him as their king and gave him goods not found in Spain. These goods and other cash crops made the Spanish Empire a much wealthier nation. It also made them a world power at the time. Through exploration, Spain was able to become wealthier by making their economy increase. Spanish truly made their empire a more successful and stronger empire through the time. And as you're thinking and voting, I'll tell you, I picked these two samples because they did something that a number of students did in part of these body paragraphs, which was to establish kind of a story, to tell a story of historical developments that would then support a comparison that students were attempting to make. So go ahead and vote and tell me why. What made you choose that sample? So we got one vote for sample B, 2 votes for sample B, gave specific examples and gave background information. So even if you didn't know the info before, it was still clear what they were arguing. Okay, got a vote for sample A. What'd you like about A? We got Nevaeh told us some good things about B. So what both of these samples are trying to do is that they are establishing, right, the historical developments that lead to empire building for the European maritime empires. In sample A, we have some good historical evidence. We've got historical details about exploration and trade, right? This author name drops Vasco da Gama, specifies his voyages into to Southeast Asia, mentions the benefit of the spice trade to Europeans and the connection between that process and the European exploration of the Americas. There's an implied connection in sample A to empire building because as an educated reader, I know that the maritime empires, the Europeans, claimed territories in the Americas after this process of exploration. I would love if sample A made that empire building connection more explicit. And I think that in future paragraphs in the essay, they might have done so. But since like this paragraph isn't very long, it would be awesome to see that connection as maybe the conclusion to this paragraph, and that sets up a transition to the next idea in their essay. But there's good evidence, right? And we want to acknowledge, right, when people are using good evidence, because that is one of the hardest things to do when you're writing from memory instead of writing from notes. Sample B, people are noticing the dates, people are noticing specific examples. Absolutely, the sample B also uses historical details to describe exploration, talking about 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, Christopher Columbus, the encounters in the Americas. What I think makes sample B a little bit stronger than sample A is the last part, which is this idea through exploration, Spain was able to become wealthier. So this is setting up the argument that exploration leads to wealth, leads to a strong economy, which leads to a strong empire. And that kind of explanation, that analysis and reasoning is what it means to develop an argument, right? These prompts are written to say, develop an argument that evaluates or compares or whatever verb is being given. And develop an argument means to take your evidence and connect it back to that topic. So anytime we see language that's connecting to empire building, we want to give that a shout out, give kudos to that. Both of these samples have strong evidence. Sample B has a little bit stronger analysis and reasoning. So good work to both of these folks. Excuse me. Let's look at the next pair of samples. These next two are a little bit longer. Sample A says, land empires were also different in that they consolidated power more rigorously than maritime empires. The Mughal Empire, for instance, like the other gunpowder empires, it was ruled by Muslims. They tore down Hindu temples and built mosques in their place. They charged a tax on non-Muslims similar to the infidel tax of the Abbasids. Still, their biggest project was agrarian reform. Their agrarian reform programs made more money exist in Mughal hands and otherwise. So that's sample A. Sample B says, religiously, both empires were ruled by devout rulers. Spanish royals were faithful Catholics, while the Ottoman Sultan was a strict Muslim. Missionaries in the Americas spread the word of God among the natives to bring them into the church, while Islamic officials would take Christian boys for conversion and entrance into the elite Janissary ranks. But converted Americans were treated as second-class citizens in their own land, while Janissary converts went on to wealth and power in the Ottoman government. So which sample do you like, and what do you like about the sample that you chose? Thinking about the three things that we're looking for: developing the argument, evidence, and supporting the argument. So connecting the evidence back to the argument. So we got to vote for B, saying that maybe sample A jumps around and B really flows. Okay. And I think the idea of flow maybe is the idea of developing, that you're building the argument over time and making those connections between the pieces of evidence. Sample B definitely does a nice job of kind of building each thought as the paragraph goes on. It starts with a clear comparative statement of similarity in the topic sentence. Then it elaborates with examples for both the Spanish and the Ottomans. Then elaborates with further examples of not just what the religion was, but how the religion is used to build strength in the empire. And then sample B does a really interesting thing at the end, where this writer takes a difference and kind of blends it into a similarity paragraph. This is probably a really good example of a complex argument where they're similar religiously in the ways that they promoted conversion in their territories, but the end result of that conversion doesn't necessarily have the same effects in both empires. And that can be a really challenging thing to do. I think it's hard to put a similarity and a difference into the same paragraph without undermining one or the other. And this person, I think, does it really effectively in this body paragraph for sample B. Sample A has some real strong points as well. So I want to call those things out too. I'm not seeing a lot of other votes. I think some of you may be a little nervous because these are longer samples, and that's okay. Sample A has good comparative language. It's a paragraph that's just about difference. And in the context of a broader essay, it would make more sense in terms of what it's talking about. The focus in this paragraph is just on the land empires, but we can see in the topic sentence, right, land empires were also different in that. There's an implied connection to maritime empires that would have been discussed in another body paragraph in the full essay. So that's not necessarily a problem here. There's some good specific pieces of evidence. We've got the idea of Muslim rulers in the Mughal Empire, the destruction of Hindu temples, the tax on non-Muslims, so the actions of Muslim rulers. It would be great to know how the Mughal rulers used those strategies as part of their empire building. I think that the sentences at the end that jumps into agrarian reform shows me that this student knows something about the Mughals and is trying to put as much information about the Mughals as possible into this paragraph and isn't necessarily thinking about developing that argument. So A gives me good topic sentence, good comparative language, good evidence, not as strong as sample B in terms of the overall development of the argument and the analysis and reasoning piece. But still some really strong writing from both of these writers. All right, let's look at, we've got a couple more of these. So I think we've got 2 more slides of samples that we can look at, and then we'll take some questions at the end. So here we go. New sample A. The Mughal Empire had a lot of influence because they controlled most of India, a big trading center. But they were different from Japan because the Mughals had a lot of different religions, like Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism, while Japan only had Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism. Unlike Japan, the Mughal Empire had a lot of religious conflicts and tension that were hard to deal with, while Japan didn't have any religious conflicts. The diverse population in the Mughal Empire made them accepting of most religions, and it also made it easier to trade, giving them more influence than Japan, which wasn't very tolerant. Sample B. Within the Ming Dynasty, silver was in high demand, with the development from paper money to silver money was becoming a change within the dynasty. The want for silver helped build up maritime empires like Japan. The trade with the Chinese helped the Tokugawa shogun, like the emperor of Japan at the time, to gain a lot of wealth from the silver trade between China and them. The Japanese used the riches they gained from the silver trade with the Chinese to improve their military. That improved the empire's protection against big leaders at the time who could start wars with them. So thinking about the prompt, which is asking you to compare land empires and maritime empires in their process of empire building from 1450 to 1750, which of these body paragraphs would be stronger as part of an essay responding to that prompt? There, I just dropped the prompt for you into the chat. So if you want to look at that as you're looking at these samples. Okay, so we got a couple of people voting for A because there's a comparative element between the Mughals and Japan. Okay. So some things that I noticed about sample A when I was reading it and choosing it for tonight, we've got comparative language in sample A, right? This a difference paragraph that's clearly stated right from the beginning. There are specific historical examples of religions in both regions. So we got a list for both. And an explanation of how those details impacted each empires. For example, we've got the explanation that the Mughals were more tolerant, which allowed them to do more trade, which allowed them greater influence. So there's some analysis and reasoning in sample A, especially in the analysis about the Mughals. Challenges for sample A is that, number one, Japan really isn't a maritime empire during the time period that this prompt is asking for. So we as AP readers would simply not worry about that as long as there's a maritime comparison somewhere else in the essay. We would say, okay, yes, good Mughal evidence, good Mughal analysis. I'm going to look elsewhere in the body paragraphs for the comparative points, essentially, in this essay. Further explanation is probably needed to elaborate on the idea of religious tolerance and its relevance to empire building. And I think that there's really some places that this person could go in terms of thinking about how Mughal rulers used religious tolerance, or a lack of religious tolerance in the case of some Mughal emperors. Then how did they use that as a way to establish or maintain or extend the influence of their empire? So thinking about religion is a good idea. Expanding that idea a little bit more and making a comparison to, say, one of the European maritime empires could have made this a really strong argument in this essay. For sample B, we have addressing two regions, which is always a good idea, right? Especially in a comparative essay, we want to be addressing two different regions. The comparison isn't necessarily clear. It's not entirely clear especially from the topic sentence in this paragraph, whether it's supposed to be a similarity or a difference. And that's not a deal breaker, but it's nice to have that comparative language as often as possible. And there's some specific detail about the silver trade, some specific detail about the Tokugawa shoguns. Challenges for sample B is, again, Japan's not really a maritime empire, so if we're trying to do a comparison to the Ming as a land empire, that doesn't really work for us. But again, we could take the Chinese examples and be really okay with that. And again, we want to see more detail about how is the silver trade related to empire building, right? Thinking about, okay, so trade, which improves the economy, which improves the strength of the empire because the government can take taxes from that trade and use it for government projects, or use it to expand their borders, or use it to defend against invaders. Those kinds of connections are things that we would want to see in a really strong sample. All right, let's do one last one, because I think people are starting to fade, maybe wanting to ask some of your own questions. So here we go, two samples. Sample A, land empires expanded in a more traditional way. Land empires expanded, well, over land. They used superior armies and weapons to overcome their adversaries. Take the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans used gunpowder to overcome their nomadic horse foes because gun beats horse. They expanded almost purely using military might, conquering the former Byzantine imperial lands. Whilst gunpowder was new, expanding using a superior land military is older than the Babylons. And sample B, maritime empires expanded less traditionally. The Portuguese used cannons to take over individual ports and then force the inhabitants to trade with them and give them a fair deal. They ended up with a fair amount of influence in the Indian Ocean and even instituted a trade pass and killed merchants who conducted trade on the Indian Ocean without it. This is also characterized by the VOC. The VOC were a joint stock company that one could purchase stocks in, and they were in charge of getting a lot of money. So, which sample do you like better? As you're thinking about the sample that you prefer here, you probably can tell from the voice in these two paragraphs that these samples are from the same student. And I chose that for this last slide intentionally because I want you to notice that that quality of writing isn't simply a matter of some people are good at it, some people are less good at it, that the quality of body paragraphs might vary over the course of an essay. And that's okay, because your essay gets read as a whole, and it's the entire essay that earns you the points and earns you the credit, both in your classes and on the AP exam. And it's completely okay if some of your body paragraphs are stronger than others, whether they're slightly stronger or a lot stronger. You're going to write what you know. You're going to write it to the best of your ability. And, hopefully nobody's going to like flash it up on a screen and make people judge it out on the internet. And if that does happen to you, thank you for volunteering your work for that. So what do you like? Sample A or sample B? Okay, so got one vote for sample A, because sample B seems to jump to different topics. Okay. Both of these samples, and I picked them for this specific parallel, they both have topic sentences with clear comparative language. That word more, right? More traditional, less traditional. These paragraphs are setting up the idea of difference. We don't have to use the word different in order to demonstrate difference, but we're using language that conveys that to the reader. These paragraphs were not next to each other in the essay, but they are connected. The ideas are clearly connected. So that connection between previous and future paragraphs, the structure of both of these is really strong in that way. In sample A, we've got a specific topic of empire building, which is great, right? It's about military conquest. That is a way that empires expanded, strengthened, and gained and maintained influence. So that's definitely empire building. We also have specific examples in sample A. We've got gunpowder, we've got, and then conquest of specific enemies, nomads, which is a little vague, but then the Byzantine lands. Really clear, really specific in sample A. In sample B, right, we have that comparative language, we have the connection to previous or future paragraphs, we have the specific topic of empire building, which is the use of trading posts and economic influence in the Indian Ocean, as well as specific examples. We've got the Portuguese cannons taking over the port cities. We've got the Portuguese pass system, which was instituted in the Indian Ocean, and the VOC. And if you were reading that going, what's the VOC? It's the Dutch abbreviation for the Dutch East India Company. Now, an AP reader would be expected to know that or would have the resources available to check that and look that up. So you would earn credit probably for that abbreviation. I would encourage you as students to spell out the names of anything that you wish to abbreviate the first time you use it. This student did not. Even earlier in the essay, there is no place where the student spelled out Dutch East India Company, but I would do that. I would say Dutch East India Company, parentheses, VOC, and then you could use the abbreviation after if you're wanting to save time and speed up a little bit. And I think the idea is the connection that the Dutch East India Company was part of the European and maritime strategies in the Indian Ocean to exercise economic control rather than the military control exercised by the land-based empires. It does seem like an abrupt jump because we are jumping from a Portuguese example to a Dutch example. And so I definitely will grant you that maybe the transition is smoother in sample A. But both of these samples are really strong. They do a nice job of communicating the ideas that this prompt is looking for land empires, looking for examples, looking for the process of empire building. So those are my samples that I wanted to walk you through. And I want to take some time now to answer questions about the LEQ most specifically, but general questions as well, things that you're wondering about, things that you're worried about, things that you saw or didn't see in these samples that you're like, well, how do I deal with that? Let's take a few minutes for some questions. So I've got specific question. How do you expand on an idea if you can't remember specific evidence to support it? This is a great question because this is the kind of thing that happens in that timed right presser situation. What I would say is that these prompts are written intentionally broadly so that you can pick the information that you do know. You need to know something in order to successfully answer the question, but you don't have to know everything. You don't have to know everything about a topic. You don't have to know everything about how the Ottomans expanded. You might say, okay, the Ottomans expanded using their military, using gunpowder, and I know they conquered the Byzantines. That's all I can remember about the Ottomans. Okay, tell us that. Explain how that's empire building, and then make a comparison to one European example. You don't have to know everything. So pick the examples that you can expand and explain and use those to the best of your ability. Other questions about the LEQ? Earlier in the evening, Addison had a question that Eric responded to in the chat on the question box, but I'm going to answer it on screen just in case if you're watching the replay, Addison. How do you recommend strategies to remember all of the small details in the world history textbook? Eric's answer is exactly correct. You don't have to remember all of the small details. It's much more important to know a few examples that you can use to support an argument. And that's kind of what I was just saying. If you can't remember everything about the land empires, okay, pick a land empire you know some things about. Do you know about the Ottomans? Then write about the Ottomans. Do you know about the Mughals? Then write about the Mughals. Do you know about Russia? You could write about Russia as a land empire, right? Whatever you've spent time on and spent energy on, the things that stick the best in your head, those are the things that you should write about. And it's most important to really just go in with like your best effort and your best mindset about this rather than obsessing and stressing over the little details. Allow yourself the confidence to say, okay, I know these comparisons and I'm going to do my best to pull together some examples. But if you can build an argument with a few good examples, that's better than listing 27 random examples with no argument to connect them. Any other questions? I hope that seeing some of these student samples has encouraged you as you're heading into writing your next LEQ, or for some of you writing your first LEQ in class, hopefully in the next few weeks, maybe in the next couple of months, depending on how your teacher is structuring their plan for teaching the LEQ. I just want to encourage you to do your best, right? Each of these samples that we saw had elements about it that were really strong. And even the examples that had a lot of things that could be improved still had elements that were really strong, whether it was the use of comparative language or the use of specific examples, or the way that they stayed really focused on the prompt, right? Do the things you know how to do well to the very best of your ability, and allow yourself the freedom to practice and even practice badly in the meantime so that you can get better, right? Practice is the way that you're going to get better. Got a question here from Chris. How do you use point of view to back up your argument? So this would be specifically in the document-based question, thinking about the point of view of a source, the author or the creator of a particular document. And in general, I don't use point of view to back up my argument. I use point of view to add complexity to my argument. I use point of view to explain why I think a particular source or author is especially reliable in a certain circumstance, or perhaps unreliable in a certain circumstance, and how that impacts my overall argument. So point of view is going to impact my argument. It isn't necessarily going to back up or build my argument. The thing that's going to back up or build my argument is the evidence, either that I know from world history, or in the case of a document-based question, evidence from the documents that I've been given that I'm using to support an argument in response to a particular prompt. So that's kind of how I approach using point of view. All right, folks, we're at an hour. Thank you so much for coming out. I hope it's not too late. I hope you didn't stay up crazy late, some of you out there. I really appreciate you being here, playing along with the game. I hope that this gives you some confidence and some knowledge to take with you in your next LEQs that you will be writing. And I look forward to seeing you in future Fiveable content. And have a great holiday, and we'll be back in December.